How were the rushes processed and viewed?
They had to go by train to London, and they were picked up at Euston or wherever Euston, I imagine. They had to be driven, I've forgotten the exact sequence now. It had to be somewhere like Crewe or somewhere like that, one of the junctions, and they then went to London by train. And Rank Laboratories picked them up. Now, the problem was that normally the laboratory, if you're working in London or within easy reach of London, if the laboratory gets the rushes by about 11 o'clock, they can have rushes by the next morning. But because of the complicated nature of the train system, they didn't get them, in fact, until about a day later. And so it was several days later before we saw the rushes. Now, we got them back, and we saw them in the local cinema in Portmeirion at about after the normal evening showing, which went about 11 o'clock at night. It wasn't ideal. Very few cinemas outside the studios have really clean screens. Smoking and that, and a lot more smoking than there is now, tended to darken the screen. The light wasn't 100%. And also we couldn't see them with sound, because normally the rushes come back and they come back with a separate soundtrack on magnetic film. Now, there is no normal cinema has double-headed projectors in it. It's only the studio or the laboratories have them. So that we only saw mute rushes, we didn't see them with sound. On top of that, we had a lot of problems. In fact, the early rushes were poor. The colour balance was bad, and Rank were going through a period, I think, of trauma. It's a horrifying thing to be faced with. You're miles from base, and your rushes aren't as hot as they might be. You don't know how well you're exposing. The only thing was there were two units involved, Brendan, Stafford and myself, and the two of us couldn't be wrong. And if we were getting the same poor quality of rushes, clearly the problem was with the lab, not with us. One man, yes, might be wrong, but two, no. Especially someone as experienced as Brendan Stafford was. The other thing was, at that time, colour rushes were very expensive. So normally the rushes were in black and white, unless you had a difficult or tricky lighting setup when you asked for that scene to be printed in colour so that you could check on it. But what you got was your black and white rushes plus colour pilots. The colour pilots consisted of the laboratory taking a couple of frames out of each scene and printing them at different printing lights to gauge exposure, and using different filters to gauge the correct colour balance. And from that you knew how close your exposure and your colour balance was to the norm. See, at that time, the American CBS hadn't decided finally to accept this series. And the first one was to be a pilot. And in fact, all the rushes for episode 1 were being printed in colour. But we weren't shooting in sequence because there were about 6 scripts, and we were shooting all the Portmeirion episodes, or most Portmeirion sections of each episode at that time. But it was only on the first episode that we were printing in colour. And I remember we were back in MGM when Pat McGoon came to me one day and said that CBS had accepted the series and we needn't bother printing any more stuff in colour unless we needed it.